You think you're free. You go to church, you sing the songs, you serve where you're needed, maybe you even lead, you pray, you tithe, you obey. On the outside it all looks right, but somewhere deep inside you feel restrained, like something still holding you. You can't name it, but it's there. An invisible heaviness. A pressure. The fear that maybe, just maybe, God's love still depends on how well you perform. That fear doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from years of striving, years of measuring your worth by your consistency, years of thinking that being good is the same as being free. But what if it's not? What if obedience without intimacy is just another form of slavery? That's what Paul was addressing in Galatians, and what Spurgeon echoed with fire. Because the difference between Sarah and Hagar isn't just a story, it's a mirror, a reflection of how we relate to God today. Hagar's child Ishmael was born through human effort. Abraham's attempt to fulfill God's promise in his own strength. It looked noble, it even seemed faithful, but it wasn't the plan. Sarah's child Isaac was born of grace, pure promise, pure miracle. One was the result of striving, the other surrender. And still today, two kinds of children fill the church, those living like sons and those still serving like slaves. Maybe no one ever told you there was a difference. Maybe you thought following God meant constantly trying harder, that grace got you in but law keeps you in, that your standing depends on how well you manage your spiritual behavior. But that's not freedom. That's spiritual survival. And God didn't send Jesus so you could survive. He sent him so you could live as a son, not a servant. So here's the question. Are you obeying God out of fear or from love? Do you walk on eggshells spiritually, afraid one mistake might push you out of his favor? Or do you rest confidently in your place as his child? One path is exhausting, the other is liberating, but both can look the same on the outside. They both show up to church. They both say the right words, but only one knows they belong. You think you're free, but are you? It's easy to confuse routine with relationship. You wake up, pray, maybe even study your Bible. You try to be kind. You avoid sin, or at least the obvious ones. You push through your day trying to please God, but under all that effort there's anxiety, not peace. There's fear that if you slip he'll turn away, that one misstep might ruin everything. That's not how a child thinks. That's how a slave survives. Spurgeon reminded his listeners that being near the promise doesn't make you part of it. Ishmael lived in the same house as Isaac. He shared space, tradition, language, but he wasn't the heir. And too many believers today live in that same tension. They're inside the church but outside the joy. They're around truth but far from rest. They serve God but they don't feel safe with him. And safety is the core of sonship. The child knows he is loved before he lifts a finger. The slave waits for approval after every task. One starts from acceptance. The other chases it like a mirage. And when you live like a slave long enough, you begin to resent the very God you're trying to please. Because deep down, you think he's never quite satisfied, that you're never quite enough. And that's the great lie, that God is impressed with your effort but distant from your heart. But God isn't distant. He's not waiting to scold you for falling short. He's longing to remind you you were never supposed to live like this. The cross didn't just rescue you from sin. It rescued you from performance, from the crushing weight of do better, be more, try harder. It broke the cycle of fear and offered the spirit of adoption. Not work harder to stay, but you're home already. Think about this. Have you been serving God with clenched fists or open hands? Is your obedience joyful or fearful? Do you come to him when you're weak, or do you hide, hoping to fix yourself first? The slave hides. The son runs home. And until you know the difference, you'll keep exhausting yourself, all in the name of being faithful. But faithfulness without freedom isn't faith. It's fear in disguise. And your Father wants more than your performance. He wants your heart. If someone asked you, how's your relationship with God? What would you say? Would you list your habits, your prayer time, your fasting, your church attendance? Would you talk about what you're doing or who you're becoming? Slaves define connection by routine. Sons define it by relationship. And that one shift changes everything. Paul in Galatians didn't sugarcoat it. He said, you who want to be under the law, do you even hear what the law is saying? Because the law doesn't whisper comfort. It shouts condemnation. It reminds you of what you lack, of what you failed to be. The law is a mirror, not a ladder. You can stare into it all day, but it won't lift you higher. It only shows you how much you need grace. And yet so many cling to it. not because they love the law, but because it makes them feel in control. If I do A, B, and C, then God will do D. That logic is clean, predictable, safe, but it's also false, because grace doesn't operate on formulas. Grace invades chaos. Grace loves you in failure. Grace holds you when you collapse. That's not something you earn, it's something you receive. And that's what makes it hard for slaves to accept. A slave says, "Let me prove my worth." A son says, "My worth was proven at the cross." And still we drift back to the law, don't we? Not because it works, but because it's familiar. We understand punishment, we understand reward, but unconditional love, that's harder to grasp. That's not how the world works. That's not how religion trains us. But it is how the Father loves us. And until that truth breaks through, we'll keep serving like hired hands instead of heirs. So let's be honest. Are you living free, or just calling your cage obedience? Do you feel like a child in the house or a guest on probation? The gospel doesn't invite you to behave your way in. It calls you to believe your way home. And no matter how long you've been acting strong, God sees the fear underneath, the pressure, the weight, and He's not asking you to carry it anymore. He's asking you to come close, to rest, to remember you're not His employee, you're His child. Maybe you've been walking with God for years, doing all the right things, saying all the right words. From the outside, no one would question your faith. They would see your service, your dedication, your sacrifice. But deep inside, there's a question that refuses to stay silent. A gnawing feeling that whispers, "Am I really accepted, or am I just tolerated?" That's not the voice of a son. That's the voice of a slave. A son doesn't doubt his place at the table. A son doesn't spend every day wondering if his seat will be pulled away. But a slave, he lives with uncertainty. He obeys out of fear. He serves to survive. Hagar's son, Ishmael, lived under the same roof as Isaac. He had proximity to the promise, but not the inheritance. He experienced the blessings around him, but never fully belonged. And too many Christians today live the same way. They are near the promises of God. They witness His goodness from the edge, but their hearts never find true rest because they're still trying to prove they deserve to stay. Spurgeon preached it fiercely because he saw the devastation it caused. Lives spent in relentless religious effort, exhausting themselves for a love that was already freely offered. And today, little has changed. Churches are filled with tired souls, running faster, serving harder, yet feeling emptier with each passing year. And the tragedy isn't their lack of effort, it's their lack of understanding. They have confused God's invitation to intimacy with a demand for performance. You don't have to earn a seat at the Father's table. You were given a seat when you were adopted into His family. You were sealed, not hired. Welcomed, not evaluated. You belong not because of how well you behave, but because of whose you are. That's the heart of the gospel. Not that you could climb high enough to reach God, but that He came down to bring you home. The law says, "Do this and live." Grace says, "Live because it's already done." A slave obeys because he's afraid of the master's anger. A son obeys because he loves the Father's heart. One walks on eggshells, the other runs freely. One counts his failures in fear. The other confesses them, knowing forgiveness is already written in the Father's hand. Where are you living today? Under the weight of constant striving, or in the lightness of true sonship? Are you walking with clenched fists or with open hands? Are you approaching God as a fearful servant or embracing Him as a beloved child? It's not too late to come back, to stop measuring your worth by your work, to fall into grace, to remember who you are. You're not on probation, you're not under review, you are home, and your Father isn't looking for perfection, He's looking for your heart. There's a reason legalism feels powerful. It gives the illusion of control. When you live by the law, you always know what you owe. You can track your spiritual performance like a report card. You did your devotions this week. You avoided temptation. You fasted, prayed, served, stayed quiet when you wanted to speak. And somewhere inside, you hope it counts. You hope it adds up. Because if it does, maybe you'll feel closer to God. Maybe He'll be proud of you. Maybe He'll love you a little more. But here's the painful truth. The law doesn't make you feel closer. It only makes you feel more aware of your distance. The harder you try, the further away God seems to feel. Because the law can reveal your need, but it can never meet it. It exposes, but it doesn't heal. It convicts, but it doesn't comfort. And yet we keep going back to it. Why? Because grace feels risky. Grace takes our hands off the wheel. It asks us to stop counting, stop comparing, stop controlling. It asks us to receive. Spurgeon said, "Cast out the bondwoman and her son." And he wasn't just speaking of Hagar and Ishmael, he was calling us to let go of the spirit of slavery that creeps into our faith. The mindset that says, "I must do more to stay loved. I must keep performing to keep my place." That voice is not from your Father. That's the voice of fear. And fear has no place in the heart of a child of God. Are you still living under that fear? Still checking boxes, afraid of falling short? Still waking up with spiritual anxiety, wondering if you've done enough to be good with God? That's not the life Jesus died to give you. He didn't come to create better religious workers. He came to raise sons and daughters from the dead. He came to break the chains of striving, to silence the voice that tells you you're never enough, to make a home for you in His presence that doesn't depend on your effort, but on His finished work. So cast it out. Cast out the idea that your place with God is fragile. Cast out the lie that says you're barely hanging on. Cast out the shame that keeps you silent in prayer. You were never meant to live afraid of your own Father. You were meant to live loved. And until you believe that, you'll keep living like a slave, even when the door's already open. You can't fake the freedom of a child. You can imitate it. You can talk like one, sing like one, lift your hands in worship like one. But deep down, you know whether you're living in that freedom or just acting it out. Because a child doesn't strive for belonging, they breathe it. They don't approach the Father with caution. They run, reckless with confidence, knowing nothing can separate them from His embrace. But when you've spent your life under the weight of religion, freedom feels suspicious. It feels too light, too kind, too generous to be real. And yet, that's exactly what makes it holy. There's a reason Jesus told stories about lost sons and open arms, because He knew how many of us would get lost in our effort, how many would drift from grace while staying in the house. The older brother in the prodigal story never left home, but he never rested either. He obeyed, he worked, he kept score. And when the Father poured out mercy on the one who didn't deserve it, He was angry, because legalism always resents grace. It wants fairness, not favor. It wants reward, not relationship. But the Father doesn't run accounting, He runs after hearts. And whether you've been slaving in the fields or running in the far country, His response is the same. Come inside. All I have is already yours. Not because you earned it, because you're mine. So ask yourself honestly, what's the voice in your head saying? When you mess up, is it shame or conviction? When you pray, do you feel welcome or unsure? When you fail, do you run from God or toward Him? Your answers will tell you whose voice you've been listening to, the voice of sonship or the voice of slavery. The slave hears, "Do better or else." The child hears, "You're already mine." The slave fears rejection. The child expects restoration. One performs to avoid punishment, the other trusts in mercy, and only one of them walks in peace. You weren't created to perform for God's approval. You were created to live from it. And when you finally realize that, the striving loses its grip. You stop chasing what was already yours. You stop clenching your fists to hold on. You open your hands, and you rest. Not in who you've tried to be, but in who He says you already are. You were never meant to carry the pressure of holding yourself together. That's not freedom, it's spiritual perfectionism wearing a Christian mask. But so many believers are stuck in that cycle. They believe in Jesus but not in rest. They accept forgiveness but not belonging. They quote verses about grace but live like everything still depends on them. That kind of life doesn't transform, it slowly exhausts you. And the worst part, everyone thinks you're doing great because you never let the weight show. But your soul feels it. Every morning you wake up wondering if you're falling behind in your faith. You wonder if God's still pleased, still watching, still proud. And when you fail, because you will, you don't grieve like a child who knows he's loved. You panic like a servant afraid of punishment. That fear didn't come from God. It was never His voice that told you love is conditional. That's the echo of Hagar's tent. That's the law whispering, you'll never be enough. Spurgeon didn't preach grace softly, he thundered it. Because grace doesn't whisper, it roars against the noise of shame. Grace tells you that your worst day didn't change your name, that your darkest moment didn't revoke your adoption, that your sins, past and present, were nailed to the cross, and your status as a child was sealed with resurrection power. You don't have to prove anything. You get to live as one who is already proven, already chosen, already embraced. So many in the church today are stuck between two covenants. They speak of grace but serve like slaves. They know the promise but still live in the pressure. They fear being disqualified as if God's love is fragile. But the gospel doesn't need your stability, it reveals His. And when you fall, He doesn't flinch. He lifts. He restores. He reminds you that you were never holding this together to begin with. You're not a burden to God. You're not a disappointment He regrets. You're a son or a daughter He rejoices over, not because of your record, but because of His promise. And when that truth sinks in, worship changes. It's no longer a performance, it becomes your exhale. Obedience changes. It's no longer about fear, it becomes your response to being loved. So breathe, lay down the burden, step out of Hagar's shadow and into Sarah's promise. You were never meant to survive as a servant. You were made to live as a child. The voice of the slave will always demand more. Pray more, do more, be better. It's relentless. No matter what you accomplish, it tells you it's not enough. You didn't pray with enough passion. You didn't fast long enough. You didn't forgive quickly enough. And if you're not careful, you start believing that the presence of God is reserved for the spiritually elite, the tireless, the flawless, the holy few who seem to have it all together. But that's not the voice of your Father. That's the echo of bondage. That's the residue of a system Jesus already fulfilled. When Jesus said, "It is finished," He wasn't only speaking of sin, He was speaking of striving. He was speaking of the endless cycle of working to be worthy. He was drawing a line between what we could never do and what He already did. But if you don't believe Him, you'll keep living like it depends on you. You'll turn spiritual disciplines into currency, hopping to buy closeness. You'll interpret silence as disapproval. You'll call distance discipline. But the truth is, you're not distant, you're just afraid to rest. Fear distorts everything. It makes love feel earned. It makes grace feel suspicious. It makes God's nearness feel dangerous. And so we keep ourselves busy, convincing ourselves that if we just keep moving, maybe He won't notice our fear. Maybe He'll mistake our motion for intimacy. But the Father isn't fooled by activity. He's moved by surrender. A child doesn't win the Father's heart with perfection. He already has it, even in failure, even in confusion, even in silence. That's what separates the child from the slave. The slave performs to keep access. The child stays because he's home. Are you home or are you just visiting? Do you live like one adopted forever or one constantly trying to earn your way back in? The gospel isn't a trial membership. It's a blood-bought covenant. It doesn't expire on your bad days. It doesn't weaken when you falter. If you belong to Christ, you belong fully, freely, finally. And if that hasn't changed how you live, maybe you haven't believed it deep enough yet. So let the law fall off your shoulders. Let the weight drop. You don't have to carry what Jesus already conquered. You don't have to prove what He already declared. You are not an employee in God's kingdom. You are a beloved child. That truth may feel too good to be true, but that's what makes it gospel. This is the moment where you stop pretending, where you stop hiding behind spiritual performance, where you let the walls come down. Maybe for years you've been living like a loyal servant, obedient, disciplined, committed, but still wondering deep in the quiet of your heart if God really delights in you or just tolerates you. That question has been echoing under your worship, beneath your ministry, behind your silence. And here's the truth. Sons don't wonder if they're welcome. They know they are. You don't have to wonder anymore. You don't have to live under the shadow of Hagar, hoping your works will be enough. You don't have to carry the anxiety of spiritual failure or the constant fear that you'll mess it all up. You were adopted, not hired. You were brought in by blood, not behavior. You're not a slave in God's house, you're His child. And children don't live on edge. They live at peace. There's a freedom that comes when you finally accept this. A freedom that doesn't make you lazy, it makes you alive. A son who knows he's loved doesn't do less. He lives more boldly. He obeys with joy. He worships with honesty. He confesses without fear. He rests, not because he's done everything right, but because he knows Jesus already has. Let this be the day you stop measuring and start receiving. Let this be the page where something shifts inside you, where fear no longer drives your devotion, where shame no longer clouds your prayers, where the pressure to perform breaks under the power of grace. You were made to live as a child, bold, secure, free. The door is open. The table is set. The Father is not packing with disappointment. He's waiting with arms wide open. Come home, and this time stay, not as a servant hopping to earn your place, but as a son who never lost it. And if this message has stirred something in you, if it reminded you of who you really are, don't let it end here. Someone else needs to hear this too. Share it, speak it, live it. And before you go, make sure to subscribe. Not just to follow more content, but to keep building this space. A place for real faith, real identity, and a reminder that grace is still the loudest voice.